Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining today's webinar. May I invite the Chamber's Americas Committee Chairman, Mr. Steve Wong, to welcome Mr. Stephen Olson, Research Fellow at the Hinrich Foundation in Hong Kong. Mr. Wong, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Stephen Olson and fellow members watching online. Thank you for joining us today at this webinar on the US-China trade deal, a brighter future after coronavirus recedes. The devastating spread of the COVID-19 pandemic around the world is putting intense pressure on economies, business, and individuals. Half of the world is now in lockdown, and the United States has fortunately become the leading source of infection at over 800,000. Although governments are eager to restart their economies, realistically, the road to recovery is still some way off. However, we need to start planning for the recovery process to ensure Hong Kong can bounce back as quickly as possible. In a moment, Stephen will brief us on the US-China Phase 1 trade deal, as well as the trade policy implications. He will also discuss the opportunities that the deal may create after the coronavirus recedes. There is a danger, however, that as the Trump administration looks for someone to take the blame for the virus, US government relations might become even more hostile, pulling the global economy further down. The coronavirus arrived after almost 2 years of confrontation between the world's two biggest economies. These tensions eased in January this year, when both sides signed a long-awaited Phase 1 trade deal. But with COVID-19 now creating the biggest economic blow since the Great Depression, the IMF has forecast the global economy will contract 3% this year. As the world's two largest economies, we all hope the US and China can work together to overcome the virus and help trade and global economy get back on its feet. What should Hong Kong business consider for their investment plans, given the increased likelihood for confrontation, not cooperation? I'm sure you all are eager to hear from our speakers, Stephen Olson. So without further ado, may I invite Stephen Olson, Research Fellow at the Hinrich Foundation in Hong Kong, to share his thoughts to us. Over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that kind introduction. On behalf of the Hinrich Foundation, a very warm thank you to the Chamber for your invitation today. I'm quite sure that all of us would much prefer to be gathering together and conducting this conversation in person. But given the obvious complications we're all facing, I'm very, very grateful to the Chamber for creating this opportunity for us to gather together on this virtual basis. So I'd like to speak to you today a bit about the coronavirus pandemic and the U.S.-China trade relationship. Could I have the next slide, please? I'd like to focus on several issues in particular. Number one, what are the trade policy implications of the coronavirus? And then number two, where is the US-China trade relationship headed in the future? Now, to be clear, I certainly do not have a crystal ball, so I will not be making any predictions. But what I will be doing is walking you through the three potential scenarios, which at least in my judgment, are the most plausible for how the US and China are going to move forward. These scenarios are certainly not mutually exclusive, and so you could very well see some blending between them. Under scenario number one, we would see cooler heads prevailing. Under potential scenario number two, the pandemic would heighten the antagonisms between the two countries, potentially reigniting the trade war. And then under my third scenario, potential scenario number three, despite the fact that the pandemic has really turned the whole world upside down, it would really be largely a non-issue from the point of view of the US-China trade issue. So if we could then, let's commence by taking a look at some of the trade policy implications of the pandemic. Could I have the next slide, please? So the Phase 1 agreement that was reached and signed by both countries in mid-January covered a range of topics, including intellectual property, at least some of the relatively more simple ones, sanitary and phytosanitary standards, and of course, as is most well known, a substantial amount of Chinese purchases of US products amounting to $200 billion. Now, in point of fact, despite the pandemic, implementation of this accord, at least in some respects, has been proceeding on track. China recently eased restrictions on 3 types of beef hormones as called for in the agreement. There seems to be some progress on strengthening protection of trademarks, and China has in fact stepped up its purchases of wheat and LPG to levels that we have not seen since 2017. Of course, however, the biggest challenge remains these substantial purchase commitments, which even under ideal circumstances were always going to be very difficult for China to meet. Now with the pandemic slowdown, which as Steve mentioned is likely to turn into a substantial global recession, those purchase commitments seem even more dubious. Now, it's worth pointing out that the Phase 1 agreement does contain a provision by which if we see either natural disasters or unforeseen events threatening implementation of the agreement, both countries can engage in consultations, presumably to try to work out some type of accommodation. But the real point to keep in mind here is that if China was unable to meet these purchase commitments for any reason whatsoever, under the terms of the agreement, the United States would be entirely justified in putting tariffs in place or taking any other retaliatory actions that it felt were appropriate. But perhaps of even greater longer-term significance is the fact that the Phase 2 negotiations appear to have been placed on the back burner indefinitely. Now, these negotiations were intended to tackle issues like China's subsidies and its industrial policies. This would have at least begun the process of attempting to address what is, from my point of view, the real core fundamental issue dividing the US and China, which is how do you reconcile 2 fundamentally different economic systems under the framework of a single set of global trade rules? In the case of the United States, of course, we've got a market-driven economy, traditionally pursuing free trade policies. And in the case of China, we have a centrally managed economy pursuing state-directed capitalism and quasi-mercantilist trade policies. And virtually all of the disputes that we've seen between the US and China reflect points of friction as these 2 very different economic systems now increasingly bump up against each other as the size and technological sophistication of China's economy continues to grow. Now, with the Phase 2 negotiations indefinitely placed on the back burner, it is only a matter of time before these underlying points of friction start to bubble up to the surface once again. Now, the final point I'll make here is to draw your attention to what has been, at least in my opinion, a surprisingly tough level, perhaps even harsh level of recrimination that we've seen flying back and forth between the US and China over the coronavirus pandemic. I'm sure all of you will recall that at least initially, President Trump was very insistent on referring to the coronavirus as the Wuhan virus. Now, after a phone call with President Xi, he seemed to moderate that a bit, but I did notice about 10 days ago at a press briefing, he did once again begin referring to the Wuhan virus in a very pointed way. China, for its part, we've seen the Chinese Foreign Ministry put forward the point of view that the coronavirus was in fact created by the United States military and maliciously planted in Wuhan. All of this comes against the backdrop of both countries having ejected journalists and back and forth criticisms about the lack of transparency of both countries on both the infection and the death rates related to the coronavirus. Now, why is this important? Well, look, at some point, U.S. and Chinese officials are going to have to sit across a table from one another and recommence very complicated trade negotiations. These harsh recriminations really serve to sort of poison the atmosphere between the two countries and will make those very complicated discussions even that much more complicated. Okay, so what does all of this suggest in terms of how these two countries might be moving forward in terms of their trading relationship? Could I have the next slide, please? All right. Potential scenario number one that I foresee is sort of a cooler heads prevail scenario. Under this scenario, officials in both countries would basically take a deep breath, take a step back, and view the pandemic really as a black swan event that was entirely beyond anyone's control, and recognize that there's no real reason why this needs to or why this should disrupt the constructive progress that both countries managed to make up until mid-January. So under this scenario, both sides would attempt to work together constructively to attempt to mitigate any negative fallout from the virus on the trading relationship. One of the first things I think you'd see them try to do would be maybe to press the pause button on those purchase obligations, recognizing that given the economic situation, that would be very, very difficult to do. I think you'd also see both countries under this scenario really refraining from any types of punitive actions, either related to the Phase 1 agreement or unrelated to the Phase 1 agreement. And then both would signal their eagerness to resume the implementation of the Phase 1 agreement as quickly as possible, and of course also recommence and commence those Phase 2 negotiations as soon as is practical. So the bottom line under this cooler heads prevail scenario would be that yes, the pandemic certainly constitutes a bump in the road for the U.S.-China trading relationship, but does not create any major derailments for the two countries. Could I have the next slide, please? Under potential scenario number two, however, we would see the pandemic heighten antagonisms between the two countries and potentially reignite the trade war. Under this scenario, all of the goodwill, all of the positive momentum that had been created by the successful conclusion of the Phase 1 agreement would be dissipated, and we would see, in fact, the pandemic serving to highlight the intensity of the rivalry between these two countries and the underlying antagonisms that exist between these two countries. And it certainly, as we've already seen, has served to highlight some of the risks and vulnerabilities that accompany the high levels of integration that both countries have achieved. Certainly, it served to illustrate some of the risks and vulnerabilities created by the U.S.'s reliance on China as a source of medical supplies and pharmaceuticals. Of course, we've also seen the Trump administration cutting funding to the World Health Organization as a result of being, quote unquote, too China centric. And so under this scenario, the pandemic would really exacerbate some of these antagonisms, and we would see any phase one implementation shortfalls, rather than being smoothed over, would become real flashpoints, potentially resulting in retaliatory tariffs or other forms of retaliation. Even beyond that, some of you might have seen Tuesday's press briefing in which President Trump took a question on this, and he didn't even talk about instituting tariffs. He expressed the point of view, well, look, if China doesn't live up to its implementation obligations, I might just terminate the whole agreement. So I think we see that as one potential scenario. These shortfalls do in fact become significant flashpoints, and the phase two negotiations would either be dropped entirely, or if they were commenced, they would basically be doomed before they started, because of this sort of poisoned atmosphere and this atmosphere of heightened antagonisms. So the bottom line under this scenario would be that the pandemic could in fact help reignite the trade war between the two countries. Could I have the next slide, please? All right, under potential scenario number 3, despite the fact that the pandemic has literally turned the entire world upside down, it is ultimately largely a non-issue from the point of view of the U.S.-China trading relationship. Under this scenario, the differences between the two countries are so deep and are so profound that even a global pandemic cannot alter the overall trajectory of the bilateral relationship. With or without a pandemic, these two countries were headed for rocky times. The phased negotiations, really even under the best circumstances under this scenario, would have only provided a temporary truce and not a full or permanent long-term resolution. And in fact, there would be even reason to question whether a resolution is what both countries really have been interested in. We know, for example, that some senior members of the Trump administration trade team see these negotiations as an opportunity to repatriate supply chains, either entirely back to the United States or at least closer to home, in order to reduce the United States' reliance on China. And I think at least arguably, we could say that at least part of China's motivation in engaging in these negotiations is to buy a little bit of time so that China can further build out its technological capability in order to be less reliant on the United States. I don't think Chinese officials ever want to be placed in the position where national champions such as Huawei or ZTE can effectively be held hostage by the United States as a result of their dependency on US technology. So under this scenario, the bottom line would be, look, with or without the pandemic, irrespective of the pandemic, the US and China trade and economic relationship was headed for a much different relationship between these two countries. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting any kind of a full-scale economic decoupling under this scenario. First of all, I don't think it's possible, and second of all, I don't think it's in the best interests of either country. But I think what you would see under this scenario would be a bit of economic disintegration. We've seen for the past 2 or 3 decades, almost uninterrupted increasing economic integration. I think we would see that start to reverse, and a certain degree of economic disintegration between the two countries, decreasing trade levels, decreasing levels of foreign direct investment. Now, the final point I want to make is to introduce a bit of a wild card that could potentially cut across all of these 3 scenarios that I've sketched out for you. And that wild card is a minor detail known as the United States presidential election. It remains to be seen how the political environment in the United States will impact any of these scenarios and the U.S.-China trade relationship. At the moment, the way it's playing is, it seems that the presumptive Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, is attempting to paint President Trump as being soft on China. Biden is trying to burnish his credentials as being tough on China, while criticizing President Trump for being soft. If this gains traction, it could limit President Trump's ability to be more accommodating towards China. He might feel vulnerable on his flank, and he might feel that he needs to burnish his quote unquote tough on China credentials. Now, I should caveat all of this by saying that in U.S. political cycles, the world can change dramatically in a couple of days, if not even a couple of hours. But at least as of now, this seems to be how the political dynamic is playing out. But that's something we're all going to keep our eyes on. So those are, again, from my point of view, the 3 scenarios that I believe are most plausible. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on these different scenarios, or if you think there are any alternative scenarios that are even more plausible than what I laid out. So thank you very much, and I will look forward to any questions or comments that you might have.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. I think the rest of the time is going into Q&A section. Please allow me to ask the first question. You have given 3 scenarios, during your presentation. I'm not sure what is the percentage of each scenario. Do you expect that the world's 2 biggest economies will work more closely once this health crisis has subsided, or will cooperation hit new nodes? Which scenario we go for?
It's it's really the $64,000 question. Look, my sense is that, for better or for worse, the implications of this coronavirus pandemic are going to be enduring, not just for the U.S.-China trade relationship, but I think for the nature of the entire multilateral trading system. We're already seeing a fundamental reconsideration and potential recalibration of the approach that countries are taking to trade. I don't think that the U.S.-China trading relationship can escape that. So I do think there's going to be some negative fallout, at least initially. Over the longer term, though, let's hope that cooler heads can prevail and we can minimize any disruptions that might take place.
I see. Another question from our Americas Committee Vice Chairman, Mark Michelson. Increasingly, U.S. and other international companies operating in China are facing supply chain challenges in securing necessary manufacturing inputs and other production from the U.S., Europe, and other parts of Asia. This situation is leading many of them to seek alternative sourcing in China and to expand operations there, which doesn't seem to fit the increased reshoring objective of, by partitioning of U.S. politics leaders. What could be the implication of the development for the presidential campaign and U.S.-China relations?
Well, thanks very much, Mark. There's a lot to dig in there. The first comment that I'll make is even before the coronavirus hit, and certainly then amplified by the coronavirus, there's a lot of talk about supply chains moving out of China. Frankly, I was always a bit dubious about that. Certainly, to some extent, we've seen it, and Vietnam has been the primary beneficiary of that. But from my point of view, I guess the way I would phrase it is we're now also recognizing that China is China for a reason. That China has always possessed a number of very compelling comparative advantages and competitive advantages, which really make it difficult to move supply chains out of China. We talk about the workforce. The single Chinese province of Guangdong has more industrial workers than the entire nation of Vietnam, for example. And it's not just a question of the size of the workforce, it's the skill. The Chinese workforce is highly skilled, which is especially relevant at the higher end of the spectrum, areas like sophisticated medical devices, where factories have to obtain certifications to produce this. Again, very difficult to move those out of China. And then, of course, perhaps most obviously, is the nature of the infrastructure. China's infrastructure is so much more sophisticated, so much more well developed than so many of these other countries. So I think, yeah, in point of fact, we are going to see a lot of these manufacturing facilities perhaps consider other locations out of China, but then I think a good portion of them will ultimately conclude that it's better to remain. In terms of how this will play out in the presidential context, difficult to say. I think you'll see at least the administration trying to downplay the number of companies that choose to remain in China and highlight those examples here and there where companies have either relocated production facilities, if not entirely back to the United States, at least closer to the United States. And for better or for worse, I think we recognize that in the context of a political campaign, it can really be positioning and perceptions more than realities that count.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Andrew Wells, the convener of our Belt and Road group of GCC. The question is, arguably, China is in a stronger position than US, as it is already emerging from pandemic, expanding trade with ASEAN country. Any prospect of the US getting more realistic about this post-election?
It's it's certainly an interesting question. The first comment I would make is, personally, I think this situation is so fluid that really, in a lot of respects, we're still in the beginning of the beginning. I honestly think it's premature at this point to talk about China maybe moving out of this earlier than the other countries. We still have to see how this infection situation is going to play out as countries gradually start to reopen the economies. We're all hoping it doesn't happen, but in the worst case scenario, we could get hit with another significant wave of reinfections that is going to lead to countries again retreating from that. So, from my point of view, that's premature. And the other issue that we have to keep in mind is that even if we do accept the premise that China, is in fact, moving out of this ahead of other countries, the fact of the matter is, so much of, Chinese production, exports, and overall economic health is linked to the rest of the world. And so even if China does, seem to, in fact, recover a little bit earlier, it is going to be held back by dampened demand in other parts of the world, or inability to get inputs, intermediary products, or finished products from others. So the fact of the matter is, I just don't know. I think it's a little bit too early to tell exactly how things might play out. I think we're just going to have to wait and see on that one.
Yeah, I totally concur with you. Another question from Mikhail Liu. are the lawsuits being generated in the US against China going to have any real impact on Sino-US relations? What do you think? The lawsuit.
I'm not an expert in this field. I'll just give you a gut level reaction. I think they're largely irrelevant. I don't think they're going to go anywhere. I think it's just kind of, static and background noise. But I don't really see this having, any type of an enduring impact. But I do want to emphasize this is I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a legal expert, and it's certainly an area beyond my expertise. But I don't think these are going to go anywhere.
Yeah, right. Okay, I myself has another question. Given the upcoming US election, some commentators have suggested President Donald Trump will make use of the agreement to score political points. What do you think about the prospect for the US-China trade deal amid the election campaign?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that President Trump will continue to view the trade relationship with China and trade in general through a political prism. We've reached the point now where, the primary focus inside the White House, for better or for worse, is on the re-election campaign. So virtually any policy issue, domestic policy issue, international policy issue, is going to be viewed through the prism of how is this going to play out in terms of its impact on the president's prospect for re-election. In the short term, at least, I think, unfortunately, with the pressure that he's receiving from Vice President Biden, I think it's going to have a tendency to sort of box Trump in to a more confrontational stance vis-a-vis China, so that he is not vulnerable to these accusations and charges from Biden that he's quote unquote soft on China.
I see. Okay, I want to ask one more question, because earlier you mentioned about the trade agreement between China and US, right? And then the long-term sustainability of the agreement remains a concern. When will be more important and likely difficult phase 2 discussion take place? Do you think phase 2 discussion will go on as scheduled? No one knows.
Well, here's what I'd say. We've got a real big roadblock in the railway tracks ahead of us, and that is a presidential election. And really, if everything started to fall into place perfectly today, which of course is not going to happen, I think it would be really, really, really difficult to begin those negotiations in earnest before the presidential election. And then of course, once we have the election, all bets are off, because we don't know what the outcome is going to be. We don't know if we'll be looking at a Biden administration or a re-elected Trump administration. Now, in the event that Trump is re-elected and the dust starts to settle a little bit, and he no longer needs to be concerned about political charges, that he's quote unquote soft on China, I think it's entirely plausible that we could see those negotiations recommenced. But as I said now, I think the clock is really, really, really running down. And if it's not impossible already for these negotiations to start before the election, I think we're getting very close to the time where it would be impossible to start them before the November elections.
Okay, very good. I think the coming question I want to ask is about Hong Kong. Because from this pandemic situation, we could see the division in the whole world, this unity. I think in the past, I think the whole world working together, globalization, are working towards the unity in the perspective. But after the trade war between US and China, and also the pandemic situation now, I could see you could see this unity around the world. In Hong Kong, when rebuilding the unity for all the countries around the world, including US and China, what role Hong Kong should take, and also to focus on in working to bring back the unity for the whole world? What Hong Kong can do?
I think Hong Kong has historically played a very important role in this process, just as being a sort of a beacon on the benefits of free trade, the benefits of integration, the benefits of having open trading relationships with as wide a number of countries as possible. So as a small economy, of course, on a global stage, there's limitations to what China can do. But I think just continuing to do what Hong Kong has always done, which is really to provide, a textbook case example of the benefits that accrue from having an open economy, from embracing open trade, globalization, and greater integration. I think and I hope that can continue to be a positive contribution by Hong Kong.
Yeah, but I think Hong Kong is now being, still affected by the social unrest issue. I think in order to make Hong Kong to exercising our influence to the whole world for making unity, I think internally, I think we have to solve the social unrest issue as soon as possible by all means.
I don't think there's any question that you're right.
Yeah. Okay. I think at the moment, I think we have one more question from our member, Liam. Does Stephen believes in the concept of Thucydides trap, and is that the direction that U.S. and China are heading?
Look, I'm a lover of history and studied history at university, but I do think sometimes the historical analogies can be overstated. I think it's certainly useful for us to take a look at the Thucydides trap and some of the past historical examples, but I don't think in any way, shape, or form that the United States and China are predestined to fall into the Thucydides trap. I certainly hope that that's not the case.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, thank you for your insightful sharing, Stephen. I think we learned a lot from you, and for sharing us your insight on the latest developments in the U.S.-China trade relationships, as well as the opportunities and challenges that the trade deal may create after the coronavirus recedes. I'm sure our members have benefited from your presentation very much. Yeah, and we will be able to take advantage of the trade opportunities that we hope lie ahead. On behalf of the Chamber, I would like to thank you for your taking time to speak with us. And to our members, thank you for all your joining this webinar. I hope that everybody will stay safe and hope that we will be able to meet again pretty soon. Yeah. Last but not least, thank you, Stephen, from your sharing from Bangkok. You are not in Hong Kong, I know that. I think you are now staying in Bangkok. When will you come back to Hong Kong again?
Well, I'm keeping my fingers crossed. As soon as we can get the airports opened and some of the restrictions relaxed, I'll look forward to doing so.
Are you still in Bangkok for quarantine? 14 days?
I'm not in quarantine, but we are in lockdown.
Okay, very good. I think thank you very much again. I do hope that your sharing today, will inspire us to think about how to really, generate unity for the rest of the world, because we do see that I think this unity is not a way out. It's not a way out. It will trigger, another conflict or even war in the future. This is why Hong Kong is so important, to be a peacemaker, trying to pull things together from West and East to come together in the platform of Hong Kong GCC. As we always reiterate, in our Americas committee, we always want to be, a platform trying to pull together, the companies from US and including the Latin America and also the companies from China to work together, harmoniously. Even though we have some difference in will, but that doesn't affect, we work together to create a peaceful environment for the whole world. Yeah. Okay. Let me see if there are any more questions. It seems that there are 3 more questions. I'm sorry that I think our webinar cannot end at the moment. I just saw 3 more questions. From Daniel, would China prefer another 4 years of Trump or a Biden administration?
My goodness gracious. Well, look, I think in terms of managing one's stress level and the number of sleepless nights that you have, I think the preference would probably be for a Biden administration. Look, more seriously, I think the aspect of a Biden administration that I think China would find more preferable would certainly be, a much more a conventional administration. And I think the unconventional approach that President Trump has taken with the tweeting, with the offhand remarks, with the mischaracterizations, with the misstatements of fact, that really creates a lot of frustration, a lot of challenges, a lot of difficulties. So I think although the Chinese government and Chinese officials have learned to accommodate themselves somewhat to dealing with President Trump and his idiosyncrasies, shall we say, I think getting back to more conventional relationship under a Biden administration would be desirable. One important point that I will make, however, that I hope our friends and colleagues in Beijing understand, and that is, I firmly believe that the U.S.-China relationship has crossed an important Rubicon. And I don't think under a Biden administration or any subsequent administration, I don't think the U.S.-China trade relationship will ever go back to what it was before. The conventional wisdom has really taken root in Washington, D.C. now. In fact, the only issue that unites Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives in the United States right now is that, the U.S. approach to its trading relationship with China has been a bit misguided, has been based on some miscalculations, and that a reset in that negotiation was long overdue. Now, not everybody advocates the confrontational and a little bit chaotic approach taken by the Trump administration, but across the board, there's a sense in the United States that things have to change. So whereas a Biden administration would be more conventional in its approach, I hope our friends and colleagues in Beijing understand that the relationship has really crossed the Rubicon, and even under a Biden administration, we'll never go back to the way things were under George W. Bush or Barack Obama.
I see. Okay, another question from Vice Chairman Mark Michelson. Foreign trade policy issues are not usually highly visible in U.S. political campaigns. Do you think this year will be different from other years?
You know what? I've had a little bit of an evolution in my thinking on this.
Evolution.
A bit of an evolution in my thinking. My initial thought was that, for better or for worse, China was really going to sort of drop off the agenda in terms of this political campaign. But more recently, I've seen some polling figures which really attracted my attention, and that is we're seeing increasingly that Americans are really starting to quote unquote blame China for the coronavirus pandemic. To the extent that takes hold, I think we could see the China relationship in general, and then in particular the U.S.-China trade relationship become a little bit more of a campaign issue. As I said initially, I thought it was going to drop off the agenda, but now more recently, this polling data has gotten my attention, and I think it could be coming back into play in the political campaign.
Yeah, and one question, from my observation, in the past, U.S., UK, and also the European Union are quite united in making decisions. Mm-hmm. But this time, I think it's a bit different, particularly after the pandemic situation. All the European countries seems to have not in sync with the U.S. It seems that the pendulum is swinging from U.S. to the east. Do you think my observation is correct?
I think it is, but the only caveat I would make is that it's really been interesting to note that a number of European officials who are traditional stalwarts of open trade and free trade and economic integration have really been striking a note of caution when it comes to China. Some of you might have seen a few weeks ago at a G20 meeting in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, the French finance minister really posed some provocative questions. And this is, as I said, a person who's a staunch advocate of free trade and integration. And he said, look, do we really want to be dependent on China for our automotive supply chain, our pharmaceutical supply chain, our aeronautical supply chain? Or should we start thinking about having more production at home? And he said, look, it's not about protectionism. It's just about, national sovereignty and common sense. And I've also noted more recently that Phil Hogan, the European Union trade czar, for lack of a better phrase, was also making some comments about this. And he was saying, look, nobody's talking about self-sufficiency. That's a non-starter. No country can achieve self-sufficiency. But I think, countries are increasingly asking the question, is it smart to have, such an over-dependence, such an over-reliance? And I think, one of the outcomes of the pandemic is, we're going to focus on, what are the drivers of making trade sustainable? Some of you are aware the Hinrich Foundation is very focused on sustainable trade.
Sure.
A sustainable trade index. And one of the key indicators under this sustainable trade index is you've really got to diversify your trading relationships and avoid an overdependence on any one economy. And I do think you see that coming through, not just on the part of the United States, but a number of these European countries who have traditionally been real staunch advocates of open trade are saying, you know what, maybe we've overdone the over-reliance and the over-dependence a little bit.
This comes right to another observation and comment that, in the past 20 years' time, we've been working together on globalization. But after some time now, a lot of countries, advocating on deglobalization. That's what, in line with some of the, you just share with us. But I think, I don't think globalization or deglobalization is, I think it should be a hybrid of that. It seems to me that at the end of the day, I think it's a hybrid. Equilibrium is the most important thing. How to achieve equilibrium among all the countries around the world to, to share the profits, to share the resources, on a fairly basis. I think that's the most important thing. And in Hong Kong, I think, we are exercising a very unique role in reaching this, this vision. But because of our natural platform, having all the countries around the world, sitting down in Hong Kong. Okay, thank you very much, Stephen, your insightful sharing and all the support from our members in having so many questions. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Everybody, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mr. Steve Wong and Mr. Stephen Olson. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the webinar. I would like to thank all of you for attending this event.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I look forward to seeing you in Hong Kong again.
I look forward
Next time you come back to Hong Kong, I'll buy you a beer.
I look forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All the best. All the best.
Thanks, everyone. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.